You're listening to Ship History Radio. Through recording, preserving, and educating, the mission of the Steamship Historical Society of America is to share the history of engine-powered vessels, their crews, and their passengers with future generations. My name is Aimee Bachari, and I'm the Education Director. Join me for a chat with Captain Richard Bowen and hear about his maritime career, including being the captain of the ship that found the wreck of the Titanic in 1985. To learn more about our organization, visit sshsa.org. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with us today and tell us a little bit about your maritime career. If you could start maybe just stating your name, where you were born, and what it was like growing up there.
My name is Richard Bowen. I was born in November 1951 in Hyannis on Cape Cod, and grew up on the Cape all my life. Went to school, went to Massachusetts Maritime Academy, which is in Buzzards Bay, just about 25 miles away. They had just shifted to a 4-year program. So I was fortunate to do that because that was the first accredited BS degree that they gave. I was fortunate that the year I came out of the academy, commercial shipping was quite good. It traditionally was a boom and bust business, so I was able to turn down jobs, actually. And growing up on the Cape in those days, the 50s, 60s, early 70s, was probably different than it is today. The Cape had a tourist economy, so winters were rather quiet, summers quite busy, quite lively. I got my start as a deckhand when I was 15 on the old Nantucket Boat Incorporated. They ran a converted World War II landing ship into a passenger vessel, 1 trip a day to Nantucket. I kind of just leaped right into it doing that, which was a lot of fun. Mostly local kids and college kids, crew, old timers, captain and mate and bosun. You know, for a kid, it was a lot of fun. Most kids on the Cape worked in restaurants or landscaping, mowing lawns, that sort of thing. So working on the boat was a lot more fun than that could be. And I enjoyed it. I liked it right off. I did that all through high school. Summer after summer after summer. And we had quite a few adventures on that boat. And then I went on to the harbor tour boat where there was just a captain and myself. So I did everything, engineer, mate, helmsman, deckhand, radio operator, you name it. We did 1-hour trips out to the Kennedy compound, which in those days was quite a big attraction. We took about 120 passengers, small boat, 65, 70-foot boat. So I got to learn everything. Get the machinery started up in the morning, and we did 6 trips a day. I did the narration on the way out, steered on the way back. So I quickly learned harbor piloting, and we even went in the fog. We'd say, well, we're going to Hyannisport. You're not going to see anything, but if you still want to go, we're good. So learned quite a bit as a kid, you know. In those days, you could put in 1 year as a deckhand or a mate, unlicensed mate, and sit for a 100-ton license, what they called we used to call it the 100-pound license. And in those days, everybody around here had some sort of a license. It was just the nature of the maritime-oriented neighborhood. So when I was 19, I got my 100-ton ticket. Nobody ever asked about the year I worked when I was 15, which I suppose was illegal, working around machinery under 16. But the Coast Guard never asked, and I took the exam, passed it. That next summer, started working. I was 19. Now, I never let on that I was only 19. Everybody then assumed you must be 21 to run a boat. So I did a couple of days a week relief captain on a sightseeing boat. And then the next year, I was off from school, from the maritime school for the whole summer. So I ran that boat six days a week, 6 trips a day. I can't tell you how many thousand times I've been to Hyannisport. And then in the spring and the fall, I would do the island boats, usually as a go back as deckhand or as sometimes a mate, relief mate on the weekends. But and then of course, just living on the Cape, you're exposed to that sort of thing. As I said, you had a choice in the summer to work in a restaurant or do landscaping. And I walked down by the docks one day and I said, that might be fun to do. My mother says, you can get a job at the restaurant just down the end of the street. I said, I don't want to do that. So it all worked out nicely.
So what were some of the downsides to working on a boat?
There's difficulties going to sea. My wife was very independent. She had her own professional career and was able to take care of everything by herself. I just came home on vacation. That kept things simple. That would be very difficult for some wives, especially if there's children. She's on her own. The blizzard comes, the power goes out, the car doesn't start, nobody comes to plow the driveway. You can see how that sort of snowballs, literally. So it takes a special partner for that.
Somebody that works at the Ship History Center did some interviews on commercial fishing. Mm-hmm. And that was sort of one thing that she talked about a lot, was how it impacts families and how women, what their work is like onshore and how they support the men going out fishing. And so I always found that to be interesting because I think that's something that's very specific to the maritime community. I mean, I'm not sure there's that many other jobs where the men are kind of off a lot and it forces the women to be a bit more independent and, in ways maybe they weren't. Even, historically, like on Nantucket, the women were running businesses and traveling to Boston and conducting business way before it was socially acceptable for women to be doing that sort of thing.
And if you recall the whaling ships, they were gone 2 or 3 years at a time. I would only think of a couple of 2, 3, 4 months gone. Yeah. One of the differences with that career was you would work depending on the company, depending on the ship, the voyage. So maybe 3 or 4 months gone and then 3 or 4 months home. And in the latter years, I was roughly 4 months on, 4 months off. Now, it was called vacation. But when you came home, you simply did what everyone else did day in and day out, mow the lawn and paint the windows and what have you. So for someone that, say, works Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, that might be a sort of a jarring lifestyle to get into.
Can you talk a little bit about what the training was like? I know you said you went to Mass Maritime, so you had formal training, but was there a sort of informal on-the-job training also, or did you have to sort of go to a maritime?
Well, there's 2 parts of that. There's an academy-trained graduate who graduates with a third mate license. I started right out as third. I went with a big company, American Export Lines. They had about 24 ships, and it was summer, so the regulars want summer vacations, and so every year they would hire a crop of recent graduates from the maritime schools. So I went right to work as a third mate. I was thrown right into it. I had a pretty good idea what I was doing because I had spent one summer as a cadet on a container ship and learned an awful lot, everything. And I was under the second mate, 4 to 8, so he stuck me out in the bridge while he did chat work. So I learned quick, thrown right into it. So I was comfortable my first ship. You were expected to learn, to ask. Captain didn't trust a young mate that didn't ask questions. And the old guys, these were a lot of 1930s, 1940s guys. Many had come up from seamen, hadn't gone to school. They knew all the old, I guess you'd say, arcane and obsolete things. And you could learn a lot from them if you asked. They also had seamen, hawse pipers, they call them, who would start young guy as an ordinary seaman and maybe become an able seaman and then put in their time. There used to be commercial schools, little schools like in New York and Baltimore, Philadelphia, that had courses you could pay to take and sit for your thirds. You also could take courses ashore. There was the Seamen's Church Institute in New York, Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, had various courses. If you upgraded or you renewed your license, you had to take a radar course, which was a couple of days. There were specialized courses for cargo. You had firefighting courses, company-specific courses. The tanker companies sent their guys to a lot of schools. As things advanced, we got the first simulators came into use. That was quite a novelty at first. I attended a number of ship handling simulators, radar simulators. Oh, nowadays there are simulators for everything, even ship-specific simulators. So the training was something that if you expected to advance, you learned on the job. You took, if there were courses available, hopefully somebody else paid for it or the unions paid for it. If you were going to work your way up, you had to continuously learn.
And so what was it like for you sort of moving up to the role of captain? What was that process like?
Well, in parts because I worked at it, in parts accidentally. I stayed with Export until they folded up at I think the middle of 78, maybe, 1978. Well, I just had my chief mate ticket, brand new chief mate, Oceans Unlimited, and I had a master 1,000-ton freight and towing. Then in the spring of 78, found myself unemployed. So at that time, the offshore drilling was a big thing, and they were just starting off New Jersey, test drilling. I believe that they were looking for gas. So I, word of mouth, got a job with a company in Houston on a supply boat, the second of two mates. We brought the boat up to Rhode Island, sat and never went anywhere, never did anything. They were waiting for the oil rigs to come up the coast. And the captain, who, shall we say, went ashore and drank considerably, the next day we were supposed to go to sea. And he disappeared off the face of the earth. We never did find out what happened to him. The shore-based manager, he said, well, you got the license, you take it. Oh, okay. So I fell into that job. I didn't stay there too long. So I picked up a job at Woods Hole as a relief chief mate, and it was just over the tonnage that it was good towards master. And then that ended, and I went to work for Gulf Oil as a third mate with a chief mate's license and got thrown right in a tanker business. Had to learn within minutes. And they stick me on there, a guy with absolutely no tanker experience. But again, you got thrown into it, you had to learn. And came ashore and eventually went to work at Woods Hole again as a relief chief mate. So I went on to Knorr as chief mate. Emerson Hiller, Mass Maritime, 1940, was captain. I always consider him sort of a mentor, one of my best mentors. We got along quite well. He could be a hard guy on chief mates, but I stayed 3 years. And so about a year later, I got my master's ticket, and then I became his relief. And then he retired, and I was standing there and standing upright the longest, so I became captain on air.
I was wondering if we can talk a little bit about the Titanic and sort of how you got involved in that project.
Yeah, like I say, I went captain on a permanent regular captain on the Knorr in 83. I think in 84, we did a trip with Bob Ballard and his crew on the wreck of the Thresher. And that was sort of a test run. Early 85, I got wind of the Titanic expedition coming up. And of course, I was the regular captain on the ship. So all I had to do was just stay there, sit there. That summer, we went out to the Azores I think it was about 4 days were budgeted to him for the Titanic. And so my involvement is the Titanic, again, was just happened to be in the job. Had I not got wind of the thing early in 85, I might have taken vacation and one of the other guys relieved me.
So were you interested in the ship previously, or was this just kind of like, oh, it was just part of the job and then it came up?
Oh, no. I had always been interested in it. I don't know if I mentioned, my grandmother grew up in Liverpool. The Titanic was registered out of Liverpool. A lot of the crew were from Liverpool. She had a cousin, a steward, died when the ship went down. And years later, I started reading up on it. It seemed quite interesting. And there was there's 3 sister ships. And I knew something about those passenger ships in those days because, as I mentioned, my grandfather had been a radio operator. And his last few ships were the passenger ships, North Atlantic, Europe to New York mostly. So I had an interest in that, how, for instance, the design of the ships changed over the years, how they went from coal to oil. Some ships were load as many immigrants as possible at a cheap fare. Other ships were luxury ships with a smaller number of passengers at a higher fare. The business end of it, I was interested in. And then I kind of got away from that. And it wasn't until I was at Hui and got wind of the new equipment that Bob Ballard's group was developing, where they could put the video cam 3,500 meters down, 13,000 feet. And then I heard the rumor of the Titanic trip and sort of resurrected my interest in it. But I'd always been interested in it. That's quite a story.
So how much of the process then did you see of them actually finding the wreck of the Titanic?
Well, I had met with him a few times on the ship about how we were going to, for instance, loading the equipment, placing the equipment. They had 2 20-foot shipping containers that bolted together as a control van. Another shipping container, 20-foot container, had for lack of a better word, had a photo mat in it. There was another camera system that used 35 millimeter SLR cameras with several hundred feet of film for each camera. So they had a whole photo developing lab in another container. And winches, all the various equipment had to be placed on deck so that everything was lined up properly. For instance, launching the cameras was the sleds, maybe 8 or 10 feet long by maybe 4 or 5 feet, sort of a box structure, heavy, full of a delicate equipment. Quite a bit of doing to launch these things, especially if there's any sort of weather or the ship's rolling. When we arrived in Azores, his group came out, joined the ship. Now, they had been on a French vessel the month before for the French Institute, the Les Soirs. From what I gather, they found nothing, but they were able to eliminate about 8/10 of the search area, the probable search area. So when we went out, we were able to go to that last corner and just, as they say, mow the lawn, towing the camera back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I think it was something like a 10 or 11, maybe 12-foot box. But getting back, well, we left the Azores first. We went to the wreck of the Scorpion nuclear sub. And the wreck had been found back then and photographed, but we were able to get the camera down, the video, and do a thorough mapping of the wreckage, the debris field. And when that was done, steamed towards the Titanic area. First thing was to put in a transponder net, which were, as I recall, 3 acoustic transponders on the seabed in a triangle. And then from the stern of the ship hung a hydrophone that collected the pings from those transponders, fed it into a computer that then put it onto a video plot. In the control van, you had the navigation plot was on a Now that I think of it, these were actually the old videos, the giant TVs, not the flat screens we had now. These monstrous, I think they might have been Sony's, these huge, probably 100-pound television. I think the ship was the blue dot and the wreck was the red dot and the camera hanging underneath us was the white dot. So the thing was to play the wind and the current and sort of a controlled drift to try and maintain position over the wreck. The first few days were going back and forth, towing the camera. Didn't really see anything. Mud, more mud, maybe a rock or two, some little fish, nothing. Hour after hour after hour. We had another TV set up in the ship's library, so a bunch of us would sit up watching that. At that point, I had little to do with the day in, day out stuff. And then on September 1st, I think it was, about 1:30 in the morning, the ship's cook, Johnny Bartholomew, pounding on the door. They got it. They got it. And now Ballard had the cabin next to me, the chief scientist's cabin, and he was sleeping too. So everybody's up and at it, piled into the van. They had been towing the camera along, the video cam, black and white video, and very grainy. Sort of looks like, remember the first landing on the moon, very grainy, almost blurry sort of stuff, black and white. And they came over one of the ship's boilers. When the ship went down, it broke it too. And a lot of the machinery fell out and went to the seabed. The hull still had some buoyancy, so sank at a much slower rate. And so one of the boilers was upright on the seabed, and these three sister ships had the same propulsion system, coal-fired boilers, and port and starboard reciprocating engines, piston engines. The exhaust from those engines fed a centerline turbine, low-pressure steam turbine engine. In those days, three-screw ships were rather common, especially with steam plants. And so the boilers were all made by the same company to the same design. They had three doors, the coaling ports. You've probably seen in old films or old movies, the old Titanic movies, where they open the door, shovel the coal in, slam the door shut. Okay, well, these three doors were distinctive to those three ships. So we had a pretty good idea they're on the thing. On the outboard sides of the camera sled, there were a magnetometer, and that started picking up a large metal object. Next thing you know, they were on the hull. About that time, we started having winch problems. And so we decided to pull everything up for the night, sort of gather our wits and go at it the next morning. So we had to sort of change our routine around. They had everything, all the information you could imagine. They had a model, they had drawings, they had deck plans, photographs of the ship taken when it was new. And he would plan what area we're going to try to get to. Again, sometimes it was just a controlled drift. What you see is what you get. So we went to a system where one of us in the van was at a console maneuvering the ship. We had run a control box into the van. And so on the bridge, they could flip a couple of switches and transfer control of the ship's thrusters into the van. And you just had two joysticks, one for the bow cycloid, one for the after cycloid. Now, the way that ship was built was there was a main engine in the middle, in the engine room, and a shaft that went forward and a shaft that went aft. And at each end was what's called a cycloid. And a cycloid is a vertical bladed propeller, kind of like a egg beater, and has whatever direction you put to thrust towards, the blades are angled so that as each blade passes that point, it sort of takes a bite of water. So you could maneuver this thing ahead, astern, sideways, left, right, up, not quite up and down. But sort of like you've seen a twin rotor helicopter, sort of it would remind you of something like that. You could go anywhere, sideways. So one of us would drive the ship. Next to him would be the guy running the navigation plot, which took sort of a fair amount of fiddling with, depending on acoustics, sea conditions, noise. The propellers themselves made quite a bit of noise put into the water. Over on the other side of the van, a guy had another video that looked at what the camera was seeing, and he ran the winch control. If we saw something dead ahead that we're about ready to ram, he starts pulling the winch up, haul up, haul up, haul up. So myself and the chief mate, Dave Castles, and one of the Frenchmen, Bernard Pilot, I think his name was, the three of us took shifts maneuvering the vessel. And then all the other stations, they took turns or took shifts. And we pretty much went round the clock. There were some glitches. You know, after about 6 hours, you'd say, I hope something breaks so I could take a nap. The weather was changing. For a couple of days, we had some nasty weather. That's when I think we sort of adopted the drifting mode to just take a controlled drift and get pictures of whatever we can. And of course, we had a schedule to follow too, because this was funded by the Navy, so we couldn't stay there forever. We had another satellite radio system that used an old Navy satellite that the American flag research ships used, generally a Sunday morning conversation, and you could even patch a call home through the thing. So we got on that and had the guy that ran the net, he was in Florida, patch us through to Woods Hole. And of course, we get the Sunday morning switchboard operator, sort of have to explain to her to please get a hold of the director. we got the thing. And then notified them, and that's when it just started. It was just the mayhem was starting. Within a couple of days, developed a conflict over who got the credit for what. The Navy owned the ship. The Navy put up the money. The Navy paid the money to build the equipment through grants to Ballard. Woods Hole operated the ship. The expedition was under the auspices of the Woods Hole, and the Frenchmen who had been billed as equals, maybe not so much anymore. A lot of conflict over that. And then the radio traffic started. At that time, we were on open voice, single sideband. Anybody with a shortwave receiver could have listened in on it. And thousands did, I suppose. So some of these arguments were in the clear on the radio. And then we had people with the Inmarsat, that particular set that we had at that time. If a call was coming through, it's sort of like an old phone. You don't know who's calling. It could be the Navy. It could be Woods Hole. It could be, Channel 5 in Boston wanting to get a scoop. And then we had to get going, head back to Hui. I think it was another 4 days, maybe, steaming back to Woods Hole. And we got into Woods Hole and stopped outside of Woods Hole, and a delegation came aboard. They went into closed door, to I guess, hash this out, because a news conference was planned for that morning. A couple of Navy brass showed up. Within a day or two, a hurricane was coming. So I had to take the ship up to Boston to ride out the hurricane. And I had to get back down here, and then went to Washington to the National Geographic for a news conference there. Nobody knew who I was, and nobody asked. I got a necktie. I got a Hui necktie out of it. And got back to Hui and back to work, because we were leaving in a few days on the next trip. And as far as the Titanic stuff, I really never heard much about any other trips anymore. I got conscripted by Hui to give some speeches locally, which was fun for a while. Got a lot of free dinners out of that.
Can you just talk about what did it feel like when you found it? Were you really excited, or what was that like?
I thought it was quite exciting. A lot of oceanography is very boring, I thought. Well, I don't have a scientific background, so dredging rocks off the bottom of the ocean and buckets of water from 3,000 meters doesn't turn me on much. We used to do some very interesting trips. That particular ship was a good, what they called a buoy ship, to put out big oceanographic instrumentation moorings. weather buoys, that sort of stuff. That involves a lot of ship handling, which is fun to do. But like I say, a lot of it is quite routine. So I was quite interested in the Titanic. I knew a fair amount about it. I knew about the construction, the layout, so forth. When we would drag the camera over the deck, I could spot things like capstans, winches, booms, that sort of thing. And the first night when it discovered the wreck, they had some flag hoisting memorial at the stern. Well, I have other things I have to do because it's going to be a long night now. I wasn't that emotionally involved, I wouldn't say. Immediately, it started up with, well, it's the grave site. I really didn't have the time for that. See, I was in an odd position as captain of the ship. I'm between Hui and Ballard Scientific Group, which is a complete different crew from ship's crew. And now you throw the Navy in that, and now you throw the French into that. And so I found myself in a rather odd, I wouldn't brag and say peacemaker, but trying to keep things, running smoothly. The French were very upset because while we were at sea, they were already being sort of pushed aside by the shore side entities back in the States. They were quite upset. I think they got a raw deal on it. Now, when Ballard's book came out, Discovery of the Titanic, he gave them full credit that was due for them, which I thought was quite honorable to do. I suppose, like many things, it comes down to who's putting up the money. And it was Navy money, and they said we're taking credit for it.
What comes to mind when you look back on your career?
I enjoyed going to sea. And I think because I enjoyed it, I ended up doing reasonably well. I didn't have the jobs or made the money that a lot of my classmates did. The tanker guys, those were the big money jobs. But I always had fun. Geez, captain of a ship that finds the Titanic, that's a good gig. My wife says, how long do you think before Johnny Carson calls you? I don't think so. I don't think so.
Well, SSHSA called you, so that's almost as good as Johnny Carson. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing all this information with us.
Okay, thank you, Aimee.
Thanks for tuning in to Ship History Radio. We hope you enjoyed hearing about Captain Bowen's experience at sea and the role he played in finding the Titanic. This episode was produced by the Steamship Historical Society of America. Learn more about our organization at sshsa.org.